Hey everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. I'm so thrilled to have you back here for our weekly author event series. We've been doing these since April, about 2, sometimes 3 a week. I think we've done over 80 during the COVID era, and it's been a really great way to stay connected to you, our readers, our audience, but also reach new people. We have so many people watching from other states, sometimes other countries, and we've tried to do what I call a mixtape. We've done, one thing we're gonna go, serious topic, then we'll kind of have something fun and fluffy and light, and then we'll go back down and up again to kind of like real life in a way. We've done everything from, John Waters and Matthew McConaughey to Colson Whitehead and, John Grisham. So it's kind of all over the place. And we're gonna keep doing this. I just think if we're being candid, we're probably not gonna be doing any in-person events till well into 2021, if that. We are going to look into some outdoor stuff, maybe in the spring and summer, if that's possible. But we're going to keep chugging along and doing this. So stick with us. You can see what's coming up on our website, magiccitybooks.com. We're going to take a little bit of a break in December, but we're already kind of loading up the calendar for January and February. So thank you for joining us and supporting the bookstore and bookstores in general. When I read Furious Hours, I was so thrilled because it's exciting to find a new voice. And I think we've all had those moments when we read a new book or we read a new article or something, and it feels like I want to follow this person's career for the next 5, 10, 20 years. And you can kind of feel a new favorite being born. So when Casey Cep agreed to or was coerced into one or the other of doing an event with us, we were so thrilled to do that. And if you haven't read Furious Hours, many of you probably have. I think we'll try to avoid any spoilers and kind of any of those things, because there are some moments that are quite revelatory in the book. And it's kind of one of those things is it true crime? Is it creative nonfiction? It blurs all the lines, which makes it so great and so meaty. I was even more excited when I found out that I don't actually have to do the interview and I can just sit back and watch. And our friend David Grann is going to be joining us as moderator. If you don't know David's work, of course, Killers of the Flower Moon, The White Darkness, The Lost City of Z, so many wonderful pieces for the New Yorker. We've had the great pleasure of having David here 3 times, and David's probably been to Oklahoma in the last few years 8,000 times. So he's kind of an honorary resident, I think, at this point. But today we're going to be talking about Furious Hours. If you don't have it, we have links in the chat here so you can buy it. It's out in paperback. We'll keep posting that so you can make sure to do that. Every time you buy a book from Magic City, the money goes right back into our nonprofit mission and back into the programming that we do. So you're supporting authors. You're also supporting bookstore. If you have questions, please put those into the Q&A, and David and Casey will incorporate some of those as we go along. So I want to say thank you to you all for watching. A huge thanks to Casey. Thank you, David, for joining us, taking a break from all the work you're doing. And I'll turn it over to you to get this going. I can't wait to watch. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. It's really, no coercion required. Like, I love the store, happy to do it. Sorry I can't visit in person. Was already really excited to do the event with Magic City, and then, got to bring along Oklahoma celebrity David Grann, who's a hero of mine and has been for a long time. Truly, when I think about, how journalism works, how to tell a story well, how to find, familiar stories and find something new within them, or how to find completely new worlds or adventures that, the world should know about. That's what I think of when I think of David's work. So it's truly a pleasure to get to talk with him about journalism, about book writing. I should say, I know he and I are probably, like all of you, completely glued to our devices and our television screens. And so I just want to say, we have put our phones away. You should try. We're going to have an hour that's just kind of pure craft, pure discussion. My wife has promised to break in if they call a state. So that's the threshold, but we will have, an interruption if any state is called. So you can hopefully just kind of unplug for a little bit. David and I have again, and I think it'll be a fun discussion and hopefully transport you from that. But David, I thought I would just start, the truth is, I think probably everybody who's literate in this country read Killers of the Flower Moon. So you probably don't need to give much of a summary of it, but maybe tell us a little bit about how you found the story. Because I know when I do these events, I often get asked, how did you find the story that's at the heart of Furious Hours? Where did it come from? When did you first hear about it? So I'm gonna just, throw the first question at you. I promise I'll answer reciprocally where my idea came from and how I found my way into it. But let's start with you. And maybe in general, how do you find ideas? What are the things you're reading to look for stories you might want to tell?
Sure. So before I begin, let me just say, we don't need to turn into a love fest, but everybody should go read this book. I had the honor both to meet with Casey early when she was working on it. I still remember a conversation where this idea was still unfolding. It was actually the first time I met Casey in person. And it's incredible to watch a writer who is in the process of working something out. And then to see it, I don't know how many, might have been 2 years later from that lunch,
Yeah.
Something like that. And to see its fruition. And just one thing about Casey's work, which I think maybe we'll talk a little bit later, and then I promise to answer your question. Casey was so nice not only to do this, but to help me moderate, since she knows I'm a Luddite and really don't know what I'm doing in my little room. It's one of the rare crime stories, and Jeff hinted at this, because is it a crime story? It's partly a crime story. It's partly a biographical work of detective work. It's an interrogation of the writing process and what drives us. And I always say, and this actually can lead into the answer to your question, which is, when I look for story ideas, there are many crime stories or sensational stories that get my attention, that I am eager to read about. I'm a big consumer of tabloids, but the only stories I really want to write about, especially when it's a crime story, are ones that actually tell us something larger about the human condition, about society, about institutional racism, something that explores our character, how we deal with crimes, how we adjudicate them, the kind of reverberations that crimes have on societies and fabrics of society. How do we deal with the legacy of injustices? So part of that process I go through is I'm always kind of reading, and I'm always talking to people. I mean, it's actually pretty basic reporting. I will randomly call people, sometimes people who I think are just smart, and just to chat with them. And sometimes they're like, will you leave me alone? I'm really busy and I have a life, and why are you calling me? And like, I hunt squid for a living, and what are you doing? But occasionally they chat with you and they can lead to ideas. And the other thing is always reading and clipping things. And I have little piles where I clip little articles and I crumple them up. Although I guess these days I email them to me more often because I'm reading newspapers more online. In the old days, they were crumpled piles, which was easier to then go through. But you're always kind of looking for that. And sometimes it can be a rare combination of sentences that somehow, often it's like the little brief in a newspaper that just sparks your imagination. In the case of Killers of the Flower Moon, I remember chatting with somebody who had mentioned this case and didn't really know much about it. And that kind of sent me down a rabbit hole. And then I went down a rabbit hole where I couldn't find much about it. And that led me eventually to make a trip to Oklahoma and to visit the Osage Nation, and kind of began a journey that when I began it, I didn't actually really even know if I was going to write a story about it. And then that grew. Not only I quickly realized it wasn't going to be a story, it was going to be a book, and it was a 5-year process. So I am really curious for you to answer this question, which is, how did you find this story? But I have a slight addendum to the question. When you found the story and you were interested in writing it, which was the initial part of the story that grabbed you, and how did that change along the way during your journey?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly want to say, David, I hear in your account of your process something that I really love about our jobs, which is they are kind of the least efficient jobs there are. if everyone knew the stories they were going to write, they wouldn't require this kind of like cold calling and reading widely. And, you're on Wikipedia until 3 a.m., but then the next morning you wake up and realize somebody else who's a better writer already wrote the book you were thinking of. So I definitely identify with all of that. And especially during COVID, there are a couple of stories that I'm following, but I can't go to where they're taking place, and I can't really do the kind of reporting I would like. But Furious Hours, I was really lucky. I went to Alabama to write one story about Harper Lee, and I found out about this other story. So I went down when a lot of other reporters did. There was a surprising announcement. Jeff and probably any other booksellers on the line with us remember, for years, Harper Lee was never going to publish another book. That was like the one thing everybody knew about her. She was a one-hit wonder. There would be no other books. And in 2015, her publisher announced that they were publishing this new novel. And right away, there were a million questions, had she actually written the book? Where had it been? Did she want it published? Who was making decisions about her affairs? Who was going to make the money? And, I went down to write that story, which I did. I wrote the kind of short web piece for the New Yorker about kind of what was going on in Monroeville. But then I wrote a follow-up story about this true crime case that became Furious Hours. And so it came out of just what you said, 100 conversations or 200 in Monroeville, this tiny town where Harper Lee had been living, born and raised there. You never know what someone will tell you that will, be that hint of an idea, or they have an idea about someone you should go talk to, and they're rabbit holes and you have to follow them all. And I find that really fun. You're sitting at the cafe and the cafe owner says, I think so-and-so used to go to church with so-and-so, they might know more. Or, their daddy was, this person's second cousin and they grew up together and he might know something, you should go talk to him. And I love that kind of stuff. I can't believe we get paid to do it. And it was one of those that led to one of the Radneys, the lawyer at the heart of my book. So my book, what David was alluding to, has kind of these three distinct sections. It's all the same crime story, but the first part is about the alleged murderer. The second part is about his lawyer. And the third part is about Harper Lee, which I know is a similar structure, David, to what you ended up with in Killers of the Flower Moon. It allows you to kind of focus in on the experience of a few people around the same core story. And the truth is, the first one of those I'd ever heard of was Harper Lee, but I loved all three. And I found them all three really interesting. And I would probably never have said yes to just like a straightforward bio of Harper Lee. She's an interesting figure. I love biography. I love literary biographies, but I probably wouldn't have said yes. But getting to incorporate those other two characters and to have it be not just biography, but like a little bit of political history, a little bit of religious history, I liked them all. And in terms of like, the process of working on it, if you got bored with one character or you hit a research roadblock with one, you could just turn your attention to another. So for me, with my first book, it was really an ideal project. But I don't know, do you play favorites? Like when you're working, do you like some characters better than others? Or
I remember, who wrote, A Secret History. Who wrote Donna Tartt.
Oh, Donna Tartt, yeah.
I remember once reading an interview with her, and I think it was in that book, she had a character, I read that book 30 years, I barely remember, but I think it was Bunny, the main vet. She said, whenever I was in trouble, I just would have bring Bunny in. I do sometimes feel when you're writing, when someone enters the scene, you're like, oh, okay, that's a little bit a relief to be with someone. But I don't really so much have favorites. It's when you're reporting, often your favorites are the people where you have the most information about, because that's kind of a dirty secret about nonfiction, which is we're not doing fiction, and so we access people's lives and their consciousness based on the information we can find. So I shouldn't say that they're our favorite, because there are actually people who often intrigue me even more, and I'm desperate to get to know, and I will spend a lot of time. But writing about a person and accessing their inner consciousness or their thought processes or their deeds and trying to kind of figure out the riddle of them is often, there is a kind of production quality to this. In other words, where does the underlying material write? Do I have a diary, court records? That was certainly the case of with Killers of the Flower Moon. And I think it would apply in your case on kind of two levels, because had a couple mysteries there. You have the mystery of this crime, which I think for people, most people have probably read it, but why don't you just tell us a little bit about that? Because it's one of the most gothic stories you will ever hear. Your jaw will drop. And I know we don't want to give away too many secrets, but it's one of the most gothic stories.
Sure.
And then,
Yeah.
and then there's a production quality. That's not the right word, production quality. There's how do you get the information? There's just where are you drawing from? Did you find the court records? How were you able to both tell us a little bit about the mystery, but how were you able to crack it and unravel something which Harper Lee spent her life working on, or a decade, I guess.
I love, David, that you're asking me that, like you're not one of the people who helped me figure it out, because that lunch we had, so folks who are listening, basically, I live in Maryland, not New York, but I go up sometimes for work. And one of those trips, I wrote to David to say like, oh, I love your work. I just want to know how you do it. And I'm interested in this case. And I'm wondering if you could talk to me about, your research process. And so I remember a lot of what we talked about is, how you work through genealogies and the kinds of repositories of information for crime stories, especially if they've involved, federal court records, and just kind of, working your way up from here's a source I have to how do I track their life in the written archives and records of this country. And so I really do think of it as a treasure hunt. And you're absolutely right. So the murder case at the heart of my book is this small town preacher in Alabama who was accused of killing 5 family members for the insurance money. And he was gunned down at the funeral of his last alleged victim by another relative of the teenager he was said to have killed. And that vigilante's trial, crazily enough, he was defended by the same lawyer who had represented that reverend for 10 years. And Harper Lee found out about this case right at the time the vigilante murdered the serial killer. And she came to Alabama and she wanted to write a book about it. So she did her own research into the case. And so you're right that for me, kind of working on my book, there were these 3 mysteries, which is, what actually happened with the Reverend? Was he guilty of murder? And to answer those questions, you went through all of the police records you could get a hold of, all the court cases you could get a hold of. I was actually pretty lucky because when it came to the Reverend, the life insurance money, which was this motive, was also one of the most, resource-rich aspects of his court life. He had to go to, civil court over and over again to collect on those policies. So I was really lucky. He was deposed in a lot of those cases. There were, documents attached as evidence in those cases where, all of the court documents, when I could find them, I couldn't find them for every single case, but there was all this information and you could find names of his relatives, names of the police officers who testified. And so just followed those like breadcrumbs back out to get the Reverend story. And for the case of the vigilante and the lawyer who had defended them both, I was lucky there. He had a, political life in Alabama that meant a lot of his early years were covered aggressively by the press. There were photographs of him. There were names of people who'd worked with him. His family was very cooperative, so I could talk to a lot of them and, find my way back through his legal life. And then for Harper Lee, I wasn't quite lucky enough to get a diary, but of course she's one of the most famous writers in America. So along the way, there were breadcrumbs to follow, but, really 3 different stories to tell and 3 really different kinds of information to make use of. But I certainly remember at our lunch, David, I was just kind of mastering like newspapers.com and ancestry.com and, all of these online repositories, which are just great for us as journalists. And I'm sure it's like, nowadays, you used to have to go to, like every small town courthouse, which believe me, like you in Oklahoma, I went to a bunch of those in Alabama, but we're lucky, there's a lot of provisional research now you can do. These things are OCR, they're digitized. There's a lot of kind of getting your footing in a place where you've never lived and maybe a place you don't know as well. You can do a lot of reporting before you go and have a lot of leads and make cold calls or send out letters. And so I really love the kind of human reporting, but it's true a lot of times when you're far enough away from something, you're relying on diaries or depositions or that kind of stuff. But truly, I mean, that lunch was me like looking at you, David, like, tell me how you do it. And, the truth is for people who are listening, the other thing I did was I went and looked at a lot of crime writers I admired, like David and Eric Larson, and I poured over their endnotes. What the heck were they citing? And, who were they thanking in terms of librarians or, the National Archives where you can get military records and that kind of stuff, because I feel like if you find a similar story to the one you want to tell, hopefully the writer's been courteous enough and responsible enough to kind of show their work, and it gives you ideas of where else you can go or where there might be, you know, preserved archives related to your case.
One of the the discoveries, and I don't know if we discussed a lot, this came later, but you found, you said you like the human reporting, and tell you made many discoveries along the way.
Yeah.
But one of the mysteries was obviously Harper Lee, who she is, who she was. That also, her story has multiple mysteries, like what happened to this book that she was working on for years? Did she write it? Does it exist? Why didn't she finish? I mean, to me, there was like, this is a mystery with a mystery. But tell me a little bit about what were some of the most kind of revelatory, moving, important human discoveries. I have one in mind, but I'll let you answer the question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I remember kind of at the start of all this, and I'm glad you said something kind of general about crime reporting and the sorts of stories you're drawn to. I always think it's really important for reporters to kind of recognize their own limitations. And I certainly didn't think like I'd go to Alabama and exhume bodies and like recover new evidence and like, you know, make a new case against the reverend or an accomplice or something. But I did feel like on the Harper Lee side, there was a lot to learn about her life. And there, you know, there had been a provisional biography of her published, but, you know, truly there was just huge questions about, right, this one book, but some other books too. And along the way, I remember, you know, people were starting to share letters with me, but I think what David has in mind is this chapter of the book. So there's mystery at the heart of my book, which is what the heck happened to Harper Lee's true crime project? You know, she had moved to this town. She spent 9 months there. She had requested these documents. She'd interviewed these people. She had sat through this court case. You know, she did the hard work of gathering all the information, but it was never clear what, if anything, she wrote. And one of the things that turned up was a chapter of the manuscript. And another thing that turned up was like a literal briefcase of materials that Harper Lee had put together. And, you know, I didn't think it would ever get more exciting than like unpublished pages of Harper Lee's work or, you know, unpublished letters people had never shared. And those were fun. I remember the day I found she had written letters to Gregory Peck and they'd never been published and no one knew he had donated them to the Oscar Library. And I remember getting those. But yeah, I mean, there was this one day I get a call from Alabama. It's like the closest thing to feeling like James Bond, you know, did I want to come to Alabama and pick up a briefcase? And, you know, it was like, well, who doesn't? But, you know, the question is, well, what's the briefcase? And it turned out that this family, so the lawyer who's the kind of hinge figure in the book who moves us from the serial killer to Harper Lee, he was dying for Harper Lee to write a book about him. You know, it was his wildest dream that she was going to make him famous. This book was going to tell his story. He had been, you know, a lawyer in these crazy cases, the case of a lifetime. And in an effort to be helpful, he had given her everything he had, all of his court files, all the autopsy files, everything he had from lawyering in those cases, all the civil documents. And she had taken it because she was working on the book and she never gave it back. You know, he gave it to her in 1977 when this all happened. And his family, when I first met them, had been trying to find out whatever happened to his materials. And Harper Lee's lawyer claimed no one knew, you know, she didn't remember the case. And so there was this big question of, was it all just a fiction? She had never actually written anything. She had never done anything. And lo and behold, after Harper Lee died in her New York apartment, this briefcase, you know, they pull it out of the closet, it's covered in dust. And it is full of Maxwell materials. You know, it's the transcripts, it's the autopsies, it's the death certificates, it's plat maps, it's her notes, it's just this treasure trove. And so it's returned to the Radneys, and God bless them, you know, again, the human element. They let me go with them to pick it up in Monroeville. And then I'm sure it was more than they ever bargained for, like, you know, every single page, one page at a time, like Casey laying it out to take a scan and make notes and make sure, you know, I had all the notations. And it's true, it was like a wildly surprising find. It basically confirmed everything these people had told me. You know, you wondered, again, you'd interview people who would say, well, Harper Lee interviewed me for an hour, and then here's a page of notes that confirms that. And, all of those documents, it really, it'd be like, David, if someone, 50 years from now, every copy of Killers of the Flower Moon is like disappeared from the earth. And someone says like, well, did he ever write that book? They're all, people talked about it. And then they find your like banker's boxes of materials. It's just total fun. Oh, there you go. Yeah, exactly. And, the human element, like, look, Harper Lee's family had told me they remember her writing it, or like her bookshelf full of books about voodoo, because crazily, a thing we haven't talked about, the Reverend was accused not of being a Baptist minister, but being a voodoo priest. And that's how he got away with all this. But right, Harper Lee, you turn and look at her shelves, there's like a row of voodoo books. She's bird dog and everything. But yeah, that briefcase was pretty incredible and like kind of late breaking. It was maybe like 6 months before I had to kind of really put the book to bed. And I just thought, thank God, it was really just exciting. And, I hope more emerges. Her estate's still kind of going through things and they have not made public all the contents, but no, that briefcase, I don't know. What's your best reporting story from Killers of the Flower Moon? I know you made your own, there I was saying I didn't want to be Nancy Drew. David actually was Nancy Drew. He figured some stuff out.
I was very similar to you. There were kind of two main trails. One was documents and through archival stuff. And perhaps one of the most, revealing documents I found, and it's a little bit complicated to explain, but I went to the large archives in Fort Worth, Texas, and I was researching the Guardianship System, which was this very racist system that was set up, in which the Osage, members of the Osage Nation, who, because of oil money under their land, the US government decided to pass a law requiring Osage to have guardians to dictate how they could spend money. And I was researching the murders of many of the Osage, which were these plots to steal their money, their oil money, and profits. And I went to Texas into this large archive, and I was researching, and I was literally, it's the kind of the process of kind of unexpected revelation where you're not really looking for. I was looking for something very basic, which just literally, I just wanted to confirm the name that a certain Osage had, who was their guardian. And so I pulled all these boxes on the guardians, and all these boxes came out, and in one of the boxes there was kind of this little booklet. It looked like a very it had, I think, a fabric cover, if I remember correctly, and all it was the name of the guardians and the Osages whose fortune they had managed. And I opened it up, and the only other thing written in that little book was if one of the Osage had died, somebody had written the word, almost some anonymous bureaucrat had just written the word dead next to it. So I was looking through it to check this name. I noticed one guardian had about 5 Osage, and there were 5 names. And I noticed next to one name was the word dead, next to the next name was the word dead, next to the next name was dead, dead, dead. And I was like, 5 Osage whose fortune this one person managed are all listed as dead in just a few years. I said, that can't be right. And I started looking through, and it just defied any natural death rate. And I realized that this little book, this antiseptic book, it looked like almost like a ledger, contained the hints of really the systematic murder campaign. And it also then demolished my understanding and the way I was approaching the case. And I don't want to go off on this, but just not thinking about the story as this kind of singular evil figure, but really this was a systematic crime where many people participated, and there were many more murders. And then there was the human dimension, which for me was the most rewarding, and it's the reason why I keep going back to Oklahoma, which is I've just made a lot of really good friends, and I tracked down a lot of the descendants and speaking to them and having them trust you with their story. And I think that's like a part, and I maybe ask you about, because one of the things I admire in your work very deeply, and I think it's often lost, is that, there is a kind of, when people trust you with their story, there's a certain honor and responsibility. And, your burden, your objective is the truth, but you take these stories and with human people, often people have suffered, and there's a real scrupulousness in your work, a real care. And in fact, I'm a little bit curious how you deal with that responsibility. How hard is that? How do you approach it? And as a side question of that, because I think it's very relevant to your story, is how do you feel about a book like In Cold Blood, with someone like Harper Lee, help work on it. It relates back to you, which is,
Yeah.
I'll let you answer the question. I have my own feelings.
Yeah, and I want to hear them. I mean, I know, sure. I remember when you read the early manuscript, you were like, maybe you're too hard on the new journalists. Like, I like these guys.
Yeah.
But I just want to say one thing. I often talk about the life insurance fraud, which is the motive of the book and which is really the engine of the true crime story. But I had an experience similar to yours, David, which is, I thought, here I am, I'm writing about this, fraudster. This is a guy who took out all these policies on his loved ones and prevailed in these huge, for the time and for the place, like $500,000 in life insurance money, 12 policies on the same person, like doing these two big companies so they couldn't track him, insuring like infant children and every relative you could get a social security number for. And, I thought I was writing that kind of a story. And when I started to look into some of the companies that the Reverend had purchased these life insurance policies from, a lot of them were small African-American companies. And I wondered about the history of life insurance. Like, what were these companies? Why were they so bad at kind of monitoring risk and taking care of a bad actor like the Reverend? And, one of the things that emerged, and it's very briefly alluded to in the book, but it's a story about, the Reverend Maxwell was just about the only African-American customer to kind of get one over on these life insurance companies, because at the same time he was prevailing in his cases, hundreds of thousands of Black Americans were being systematically exploited by the life insurance industry. They were being charged too much for the policy. The policy was substandard, or the company refused to pay, or they kept charging them fees after the insured had died. And it was a tremendously predatory industry. And at some moment I had I am writing one story, but I have to acknowledge this other one because it's so unusual. And my moment of the name in the ledger was when I thought, okay, Tom Radney had every reason, that's the lawyer in the book, to defend the Reverend. But I was surprised to find a lawyer who had represented Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King had also represented the Reverend. And it was in one of these civil cases because he was making a civil rights argument about the life insurance industry. And he went before a jury in Tuskegee, he's right in Macon, and says, this is a case, ignore what they're telling you about this guy. This is a civil rights issue. They are depriving Black customers of the policies they're owed, and they will cast these aspersions and they will do anything to keep you from getting your money. So I remember that moment kind of thinking like, well, I've got to find a way to not just make it a fraud story. It's got to acknowledge the overall state of the industry at that time. But, you're asking the right question, like, what's it like to write about real people? And I know, like, Lost City of Z, like, you're sometimes dealing with like survivors like several generations later, but sometimes you're writing about actual living people who have opinions about the work, or even when it's some ancestor of theirs, they've been told one version of events and they really want you to be responsible and attentive to that version, but of course someone else has a totally different version. And I take all that seriously, but I think like you feel like the bedrock commitment is to the truth and to accuracy and to finding, if you're ever going to represent some kind of uncertainty, to attribute it to the place where you found it or the person who's informed you of it, and to just be as scrupulous as possible. And I think for me with this book, one of the reasons that felt so important is it is Harper Lee's story. She had helped Truman Capote out in Kansas with In Cold Blood, and letter after scathing letter, she just expressed her disapproval. And I think you and I both probably feel as lucky as anyone to get to work at the New Yorker. And, fact checkers, every time we write something for the magazine, pore over it. Every word, every clause, every sentence. I was like writing a fact checking annotation before we started for a book review. And, I love it. They're so serious. And it's both a loving and an adversarial process. And I hired a fact checker for my book to do the same thing. And it feels so important to me that it is heartbreaking to go and look at In Cold Blood and some of the things Harper Lee pointed out that made their way through. And, some of them are really small, like we all make mistakes. Like Capote got some of the like auction values wrong on the Clutter family estate. So for those who don't remember, In Cold Blood is the story. It's a home invasion story, and it's a murder of one nuclear family in a very small Kansas town. And the book was supposed to be about that small town. It started as an article, but eventually Capote's aperture kind of widens for the two murderers, and he follows their trial, and he follows what happens in their case until they receive the death penalty. And Harper Lee went out to Kansas and helped him with all that reporting, and she knew what people had said, and she had her own read on the case, and she really disagreed with the perspective he took and the kind of overall the apologia he made for these two murderers, and really felt like his ethical compass had wavered, and that there were real acts of speculation about what had happened or what it had all meant. And so I think those are represented in the book and appropriately attributed to her. But I share some of those anxieties, and I share some of that kind of feeling about the obligation we have to sources and the obligation we have to uncertainty. And so I think, some people I've talked to who were frustrated with Furious Hours, wish I had speculated more, or, I had said what I thought, or, on the other side of this, like, what did I think happened, or this or that? And it's just not the kind of strategy I took with the book. And in general, it's not really the one I feel comfortable with in journalism. But that does lead me to be kind of harsh on like Tom Wolfe and Joan Didion and some of these titans of the new journalism, because they wrote great books. And, how do I feel about In Cold Blood? It's a beautiful, perfect aesthetic object. I remember reading it again down in Alabama, just thinking, I will never be able to do this. The level of detail, the pristine description, the psychological complexity, I'll just never have the access or the kind of permission to invent that Capote did. So I don't know. I mean, David, what do you think? You're like, just you're closer to the new journalists in terms of age and bravado, but I feel like, you can't be totally there because you're not filling people's heads with things you don't know.
I always say In Cold Blood is, it's a great novel. I just, as someone who writes nonfiction, when he's in people's heads where they're dead and he has no way of knowing things, and the unreliability of me not knowing where information is coming from.
Yeah.
So as you say, I think it's an extraordinary book, but when people consider it a true crime book, it's a true crime masterpiece, I always bristle because he just takes liberties that I think when you're writing about a nonfiction story is different.
That was kind of Harper Lee's point, nonfiction novel, which was the preferred term that Capote went around using, it's just Harper Lee was pulling her hair out, it's either nonfiction or it's a novel, Harris explains so neat.
Right.
Yeah.
I do think partly it's funny because I read an early manuscript and I sent back to her, but I've always felt very strongly about the Truman Capote, and I was more of a question of curiosity. Some of the new journalists I never thought of quite in the same category, that while their approach and their techniques were very literary, I hadn't heard as much rumbling about their underlying reporting being questioned. So, and I just don't know enough. But Capote,
although it was right around the time Gay Talese's new work was under so much scrutiny, so it was a moment where I do just think, I mean, it's funny when you said you want to know where things are coming from. I always think, all writers owe is a kind of straightforwardness, meaning I think you just need to tell the reader what you're doing. And I don't think Capote does that. He doesn't represent the different kinds of writing he's doing.
And I think, part of the challenge of nonfiction is how do you take what you know and that evidence and then create a story that hopefully pulls people in and shows and involves techniques where it's not a Wikipedia entry, but is factually based, where you can annotate the sentence, as both you and I do, and we have fact checkers. I hire a fact checker for my book, and when I write for the New Yorker, you have the fact checkers there. So that the same process where you go through that. And I also think, and actually, it's kind of changed as I've done it more over time. I think when I was young, I had a foolish, youthful arrogance about me, which is, you think, you've watched too many movies about reporters and you think you're going to expose the truth and it's just going to be so clear. And then you get older, you realize, oh, it's really complicated and there's multiple versions and how do you attest to the versions, and then you sort it out. And I think one of the things that you do, it's the thing I admire, and you've talked about it, is that uncertainty. There is a level of uncertainty that needs to be acknowledged when it exists, and that it should not be painted over. And I had an editor early in my career, a guy named Michael Kelly, who died covering the Iraq War, but I remember talking about a writer who named nameless, who actually went on to have various problems in their work. And I said that, I just had read something about it. I said, oh, that person's a really good writer, like a really good writer. And he says, no, that person isn't, because it's always black or white. And they don't acknowledge the uncertainty that is reality. And then in doing that, they end up shading the truth. And that was something that always stuck with me, but I don't think I fully understood it until I got older.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really do. There's like a paragraph I think of sometimes in my book that I said earlier, like our jobs are so inefficient. And, truly, if you could see the time lapse of that paragraph, it took me like literally 2.5 years to write it, because every sentence is like the summation of what someone told me about Harper Lee's work on this case. So it's like this factorial where it's like, well, maybe she wrote this, or in this letter she says this, or she told someone else this. And, it's like anything. Your editor calls you one day and says, how's your book? David's working on a new book. David, how's your new book going? It's going great. I'm almost done. And you call the next day and he's like, I've written none of it. Like, I want to be fair to Harper Lee. Writing is one of these kind of fungible jobs where like you never know how much is actually done or how close you are. But that paragraph is there. And, I'm sure for some readers, they hate it because they just want to know what I think. And they want to know what the most reasonable summary of her work is. And of course, for me, it's like they're all reasonable. I wouldn't have included them if they aren't reasonable. But to your point, we won't know the truth until we know the truth. And until then, I feel like the best I can do is give you the most reasonable summaries and, what this person told me, and weight it as much as I can. But yeah, I love that paragraph. It represents the full range of possibilities.
Now, did you hear from any of the people from Harper Lee's people? Because you kind of cracked her inner circle, which I don't, I can't say I read every biography or know everything about Harper Lee, but I was actually really surprised because I had always heard that was a very kind of hermetic world where they didn't talk. And you spoke to people, if I remember correctly, you spoke to people who knew her.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was really lucky. I mean, I know you were talking about how you go back to Oklahoma. One of the things I love about, I hope my next book, I hope, is kind of similarly place-based, because certainly one of the things I feel like that happened is just I have a lifelong connection to Alabama. And, that's like Harper Lee's friends and family, all of whom are really great, but also Tom Radney had this actually pretty liberal political career. So I feel like I know like most of the Democrats in Alabama. Now, actually, there are 800,000 of them, so it's not a small number. But I just really loved the place and loved getting to talk to people. And certainly with Harper Lee, yeah, I mean, especially she never had children. She was never married, but she was very close with. She's got 3 nephews and a niece. And actually, if you can believe it, her niece owned a motel in the town where all of these murders took place. So Harper Lee, you might remember this from the book, she was incredibly frugal despite being like a millionaire many times over. She was a real cheapskate. So I think one of the reasons she settled on the Maxwell case was she didn't have to pay for housing.
I was just going to ask, how do you think she was drawn to that case?
Yeah. Well, the 9 months she was there, she lived in, the niece was married to a guy who owned a motel in town. So Harper Lee didn't have to pay for her room. And then her niece helped her rent this cabin on the lake for basically nothing. It was a school teacher who was just delighted to help Harper Lee out. And yeah, I mean, I enjoyed getting to talk with them, and I was really lucky with a lot of the documents they shared. And I do feel like, when you are writing someone's story, you always want to get as close as possible. And I tried with all 3 characters. Actually, I mean, the Maxwell family in their own way was complicated because, of course, publicity was the last thing they wanted, in his lifetime and in theirs ongoingly. And factions of that family feel very differently about what happened. Some continue to profess his innocence. Some do not. Some are still close with Robert Burns, the Vigilante's extended family. So, and there are still some members of the Reverend's family who never acknowledged me or participated in the book. So I think those factions, it wasn't just the Lees. Everyone's life is complicated, and families make very different decisions about the press, but certainly I feel a close connection to Alabama, and have been able to, not during COVID, but was down there a lot last year, and hope to go back as soon as things are kind of back to normal travel wise. And it sounds like for you, that's your relationship to Oklahoma too. Yeah, it's very sweet to me. I feel like I grew up in a place with a very distinctive identity. And what I love is when you find the stories that kind of are like portals to some other place,
Yeah.
that you really do get to know it and get to make friends there and just kind of follow it. Like I was never, I was glued as much on Tuesday to Doug Jones's results as like anybody in the country, just wanted to see how he did. And he's a great senator. I'm sorry he wasn't reelected, but I imagine same for you. You're like following House races in Oklahoma or something.
Correct. Yeah, and well, mostly just to how things are happening, things with the virus, and it's also that's been a real project because it has been a place I go back to a lot and haven't been able to because of this. But for me, being a reporter, I am actually fairly shy, not very social person. Thank God I have my wife who gets me out in the world. And I spend most of my time kind of often in my work reading or in isolation. And
David, I gotta interrupt you. These people can't believe that. Okay, so probably everybody listening has read Killers of the Flower Moon, but if they've never read Lost City of Z, David is like the most adventurous colleague I have. What do you mean you sit behind the computer? You go hunting in the Amazon rainforest.
It's like that, but the reporting is an excuse. I think it is a way to do all these things and go to places and meet people and actually do all these things you would not otherwise do with your ordinary life. Now, I don't know how much more time we have. I guess I have a couple more questions, but one was, I did want to just touch one more time on Harper Lee in terms of the case, because I just think, just because I think people listening, who haven't read the book, it's like, because that is just so interesting, like the centrality of this case. I mean, we talked about your interest about it. Who wouldn't be interested in it? But talk a little bit about Harper Lee and like her attraction to this case, why she wrestled with it for so long. I mean, I just think it's like, that is just a fascinating conundrum. And as a writer, I think I'm especially interested in that relationship to a story that consumes the person for so long. And
yeah, I mean, it's true, David, like your bailiwick are these obsessions, and this falls into the category of one of Harper Lee's obsessions. And so we're fine on time. I'm going to answer this and two of the questions that are here from audience folks too. And so that someone asked me what the big book is behind me. I'm not going to pick it up because I'm worried about damaging it, but it's a Bible, which is sort of an explanation, I think, both for my interest in the case, but also a little bit Harper Lee's. And there's another question about the word reverend. I use that, I kept referring to Reverend Maxwell, and the question is, how do I feel about using an honorific like that, when it's being applied to a serial killer? And so I think those two questions about religion, I mean, straightforwardly, Harper Lee is who brought me to this case, but in all honesty, one of the most fascinating aspects for me was the Reverend Maxwell. And I'm fascinated by religious history. His story, he was ordained a Baptist minister. He wasn't, I use that title. I mean, obviously, in certain traditions, he could have been defrocked even just based on the allegations or on the trial. A governing church authority would have removed his title, but he had it until he died. And I use it not primarily for that reason, but because that is his honorific in this part of Alabama. He is still today the Reverend Maxwell, and you'll go down there and be talking to someone in Coosa County, and truly the Reverend is enough and they know who you mean. So I feel like for me, that title is built into his mystique and the persona he had, and all of the voodoo allegations, none of which were ever proven, really just emanated from that sense of, his moral and religious authority and his power in the community. And I think that's one of the things that drew Harper Lee to the case. If you go back and you read To Kill a Mockingbird, she's interested in religion and the role it plays in small town life and the kind of authority of those ordained figures. I think one of the most interesting characters in the novel is Reverend Sykes, who runs the Black church where Calpurnia goes, and who exercises a great deal of authority in white society because of his collar and his title and his ministerial role. And I think that, the other kind of central religious aspect of that novel is the Missionary Society, and it's a bunch of hypocrites. And Harper Lee, with her super sensitive, novelistic eye, looked around a town and thought, this is where hypocrisy and this is where human frailty are most exposed. You know, this community of people who purport to be religious and moral are often some of the most transgressive and hypocritical people I see. And that's very interesting to me. And I think in this case, it's very, very interesting. I remember talking to one of my childhood preachers. I grew up in the church, and I was telling him about the book, and he was truly upset. You know, he was like, couldn't you find a better minister to write about? You know, this is really bad publicity for the church. You know, like there are a lot of us just doing God's work, and we laughed about it. But of course, you know, I think part of the reason the Reverend was able to get away with this is who he was. And, you know, the deference that people make to religious authorities, the excuses they will make for them, and the kind of permissiveness. And we see that over and over again, you know, with evangelicals in the Trump era, or, you know, Catholic priests during the sexual abuse scandal. There is a real tightrope between the high expectations we have for religious leaders and the absolute allowances we make for them. And again, I find that really fascinating. The other thing that I think kind of drew Harper Lee to this case, and it's present in Mockingbird too, is the vigilantism and the ways that we as a moral community are often kind of confounded by the laws we have and the ways that they do or do not execute real justice. And so with, you know, Robert Burns pulls the trigger, murders the Reverend in front of 300 people. He was I don't want to spoil it too much, but, you know, his trial, which I, again, don't want to spoil it, you know, has a very surprising ending for a murder with 300 witnesses. And, you know, the DA who argued that case, I think thought it was going to be a slam dunk and really struggled with it. And that, again, is, I think, the kind of moral discernment that was very interesting to Harper Lee. You know, what do we do when we look around and our courts fail to bring about a kind of deep sense of justice? Do we act outside of them? Do we revise our laws? How actually do we kind of make meaning in our moral communities when the courts don't do it or can't do it, or do it in ways that are, you know, systematically unfair to one group of people or another group of people? And I really do think those are the kind of deep things that attracted her about this case. And, you know, David, you're right. Like, as writers, I just think it's fascinating. There's another writer I really like, Norman Mclean. You know, he wrote A River Runs Through It. And Norman Mclean, yeah, the Fire book. Norman Mclean, for much of his later life, struggled with a book on Custer and Custer's Last Stand. And, you know, Harper Lee had her own shaggy dog she was chasing, but, you know, if you struggle with your book on Custer, like, talk about the metaphors, right? You know, you can't win the battle. And it's just, you know, there's like some manuscript material, same thing as Harper Lee, a ton of research. And so I think these unfinished projects are really interesting. And you're right to ask, like, what drew her to it? And I think she had a lot of personal things that kept her from finishing this book. But the truth is, the story itself, for all the ways that it's just salacious and straightforwardly, you know, a kind of bestseller like book, I think it was a hard book for her. And she was in the thick of it right after it happened. So, you know, there's all sorts of stuff about the Maxwell case in particular that met her writer's block in general. But yeah, I agree. I mean, obsessions of all kinds are fascinating, but somehow when it comes to writers, you know, the books they just couldn't finish, or the books they just never published, I think that is a very tantalizing through line. And especially when it comes—
terrifying.
What's that? Terrifying.
It's every writer's terror. I mean, I'm in the middle of it right now.
Oh gosh, well, that can't be true. Yours has got to be going better than the Maxwell case, because it hasn't been 40 years yet.
Now, and if there's other questions, you can take them too. But one question too, I just had about, in terms of, we talked a little bit about your approach to writing the story.
Yeah.
I wanted to hit one beat though on Harper Lee.
Mm.
You know, she's someone who's written a novel. She helped with In Cold Blood, her friend, Truman Capote, who approached the story a certain distinctive way. Nonfiction novel, I guess is what they called it. How did she want to approach the story as someone who had obviously immense capabilities as a writer, and obviously was someone who had written this kind of autobiographical novel? You know, what was her approach? What was she thinking about? And did that change a little bit as she wrestled with the subject?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to read this question from the audience, because I'm going to give a brief answer about Harper Lee. But David, I'm curious. Tommy asks, and you'll see why I want to connect this to your question. If you get stuck or overwhelmed by so many possible paths when writing, how do you break it down or make it manageable enough to keep moving forward? Also, how do you know when to stop researching and when the story is done? And you're smiling because that is the kind of $1 million question. And I think to some extent, what happened with Harper Lee in this book, I always try to point to the story of Mockingbird, which I won't tell in full detail, but basically Mockingbird is a book that took Harper Lee a great many years to write. And she produced a draft that, if you've read Ghost at a Watchman, you've read the early incarnation of Mockingbird. And if you compare it to Mockingbird, you can see how over 2.5 years, a very talented editor helped her make a better book out of a kind of messy, bad draft. And I think one of the things that happened, to Harper Lee is that editor died. The agents who had handled Mockingbird, both the book and the film, died, and she lost the kind of editorial infrastructure that really helped her as a writer, because she was an incredibly dysfunctional writer. She was a perfectionist. She struggled with all sorts of interpersonal issues that made it hard to write, hard to get started, hard to quit, hard to put it all together. And, when you look at her materials on the Maxwell case, it's exactly like Tommy's question. She did all the interviews. She had mountains of documents. She read dozens of books about voodoo and, pulpwooding and about the history of Alabama. She had done all the research, but she could never bring it together. And I think that is a space where a lot of great stories and wonderful ideas do kind of never come together. They die in that well between, exactly what you want to say and you never figure out the structure or how to do it. And, Harper Lee did at least creatively try to respond to that. I think what David's alluding to, and I kind of tell you a little bit about this in the book, but basically she set out to write nonfiction and then seems to have taken a turn to fiction. So when she realized she couldn't find all the facts she wanted, she did at least briefly try to turn it into a novel. And that's not something, I would ever kind of make recourse to, but I certainly do know people who have pursued a project in multiple forms. They wrote a short article about it, they tried to write a long book about it, or, they got interested in something, but when they found they didn't have enough nonfiction material, they wrote a novel about it. And certainly people play around with forms and they experiment. So I don't think she had a bad idea, but she really did not have what I feel very lucky to have. And to answer your question, Tommy, how do I know? I mean, I feel like often I'm really lucky. I just have editors checking in, how's that piece coming? Where are you? Or, my wife, who's also a writer. Yeah, my wife, who's also a writer, says, are we going to pay our mortgage or not? Or are you going to meet the book deadline or not? And I think those kind of pragmatic questions are actually really important, because at the end of the day, I'm not quite Harper Lee. I don't fetishize writing as, I think writing is art and artistry, but I think it's very easy to lean into the kind of mystique and, truly just mystical aspects of it. And I think it's also a job. And at the end of the day, you have to draft, you have to share your work, you have to let editors in. I don't think of it as a kind of solo and hermetic craft the way that she did. I feel blessed to have great editors, great readers, great fact checkers. And I feel like when I hit those walls or when I'm unsure, maybe you're not lucky enough to write professionally, but you have friends and family, and you can build a community of readers who will give you feedback and kind of pull you out of the well, which I think is a very easy place to get lost in. Of it will never be done, it will never be perfect, I want the platonic form, I'm going to take 20 more years. Like, don't do it. Don't let yourself be that miserable. Just ask for help or work on some other project. But what do you think, David? I mean, here we are, we're like book deadline week for you,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I always have some ideal in my brain that I set off to when I work on a story. It starts to take shape. And I'm actually odd in that I always think there's actually kind of one platonic way that a story should be. And then I try to reach it. But I look at every project I do as a failure, which it probably explains my misery. But then you move on, and then you go to the next one, and you set your new platonic ideal, and then you go and you get as close as you can, and then you realize you're never going to get there. But I do think that one of the things you said, I think, is really true, which is so much of writing is demystified. In that, I mean, there are probably a few writers where, there is this kind of, they write at a level of beyond, they almost like they're channeling some other being in the way they write. there are a handful of those, and you read them for centuries. There aren't that many.
Yeah.
But a lot of writing is, you sit at your computer, or you used to probably sit with a quill and and you just do it. And I always joke, because sometimes it's really just how long you're willing to sit. And I always think that's the difference between a writer and a non-writer. It's just you're willing to have the patience to just spend a lot of time doing it. And that's really the biggest difference. And I treat it, people say, what's my schedule? My schedule is just like anybody else, get up in the morning, have the coffee, read the paper, read the tweets, get upset, and then go and then go to the computer and work for 4 hours, either reading, researching, outlining, and writing. Go have lunch. Now that the one nice thing about COVID, the only one benefit of it is, I got the whole family home. My family joked that I was social distancing my whole life now, and I always joke that they're like invading my space, my workspace. But and I have lunch with the family, and then I go back to the computer. And there really isn't. I mean, I think in some ways that's comforting, though. There isn't some secretive mystery that you need to crack. You got to read a lot of books. If you're doing outlines, you have to do your interviews. You have to spend a lot of time outlining, thinking about the structure, working on the outline, talking to people for insights, then working on a draft. As you say, show the draft. I mean, there is a mechanic. There's some mechanics to this, and you have to. And I do think it is something. The one nice thing I think about writing too is you do get better, I think, over time. I don't know if you get better necessarily in terms of prose, but you get better in terms of the mechanics. They become more familiar about what you need to do. As we were talking about the research process, who are we sending the FOIA request to, what government agency? How do I do the genealogy? Who would be a good person to speak? And I think so. There's a lot of mechanics to learn and master. There's a craftsmanship that you can actually learn, I think, over time.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, everybody's got to find their own process. And it's so funny. As soon as you started talking about the mystics, I realized I just profiled one of those kind of once in a century writers for the magazine, this woman, Marilyn Robinson. And,
oh, yeah, I love that piece, and I love her work.
I mean, she's extraordinary, and now
I get the Bible and the religious interest, though.
Yeah, well, I bow down before her because, my goodness, she really is channeling some other realm. And so, you have to find your own way. David and I think, are very, sublunary with our work, but there are the Marilyn Robinsons, toiling away in their towers. And we're coming close to the end here, and I'm just going to say, so there's a question from Penny Weaver, who I will give away. For those of you who have the book, there's a beautiful photograph of Harper Lee near the end of her life in the assisted living home. And Penny actually took that picture, so I'm going to acknowledge her. She must be logging on. But Penny would like to know what we're up to, David. What's our next project?
So
you're not obliged to say what your next book is, but I think
I don't mind saying. I mean, at least in a loose way. I mean, this is, and I will demystify the process. I think I did this once. My wife told me to hide this, and I had to move the computer over a certain way. So the new book, is down in those piles somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
It will come out at some point. It is in there. But the new book is. It's about a voyage in chase of a galleon, a Spanish galleon, and it ends in a shipwreck. What kind of drew it to me? I mean, part of it was what drew me is what always draws me to stories is, and this is an older story. It's actually the oldest story I've ever written in terms of time. But is I don't think human nature changes. So that's why it's funny. I always wrote contemporary stories, and now I travel much often more back in time in history more than I used to early in my career. But the nature of humans, I don't think, has changed, and it's kind of a constant. And you could change the veneer and the dress and the accents and the clothes, but certain things that make us who we are, or in our failures, our hopes, and all that stuff, I think there is this kind of similarity. So, anyways, I was very interested in the social anthropology of these humans on this boat, living in very tightly packed conditions, suffering scurvy, crazy epidemics, children on that boat, older people, father and a son on this voyage. Also with these notions of imperialism, of this other notion that I wrestled with with Killers of the Flower Moon, this kind of sense of European and colonial superiority, of the sense of that somehow set them apart. They saw themselves as being set apart, and then they end up shipwrecked, and the bounds of the ship and of civilization gradually unravel, and they end up fracturing into different parties and different almost governments, and there are marauders, and there's just all these kind of things. And so it's kind of, and then it also deals with something that we've talked a lot about, which is these people all then, and I won't get into this part, but they all had to tell their story in many ways with their lives at stake. And so it's a lot about storytelling and how people manipulate their stories. And to me, that really resonated with the time we live in. So here is a story from 1700s, but what really fascinated with me, especially living in this time of disinformation or manipulations, or how we process the truth and how we tell our story, and how stories prevail whether they should or not. And so it's also a battle, not just of human nature to survive, but it's also a battle of stories.
Yeah, well, nobody listening knows, kind of right before we went live, David was joking about being Captain Ahab and his little ship there. And I am thinking about all of the ways that we are all kind of shipwrecked. And you know, I feel so blessed to be in a happy marriage, because I have thought about people who aren't. And of course, there were these horrible stories early in the pandemic about domestic violence surges and, you know, child abuse reports being up. So it is funny just how quickly the shipwreck is a very ripe metaphor for life and the experience of it in different ways. So yeah, I mean, that's wonderful, and I can't wait to read it. I'll give a slightly shorter answer, only because that fact-checking annotation, I can hear the siren song of it from the table, you know, get back to work. So it's not a book project, but I will say, for people who are looking kind of for something to read in quarantine, I just finished this piece about William Faulkner for the magazine. And there's a wonderful new book out that's about the Civil War in Faulkner's work, and kind of metaphorically the Civil War and his own life around race and integration and the question of the civil rights movement. So I found that piece really wonderful. And to David's point about the kind of iterations of human experience and the history of this country in particular, you know, I spent most of the last few months just rereading Faulkner, and beautiful novels, but, you know, just tragically prescient, and all of the same questions that we're still struggling to answer and come to terms with, and figure out how to relate to one another and make room for different kinds of lives and people, you know, just incredibly prescient. So that piece, I think I'll close that piece next week, which, David, you will appreciate. Where does that mean I am on a Thursday? I'm getting the annotation done and waiting for copies and everything else. So I just want to say thanks again, David. Truly a pleasure. And I know probably this chat was all Oklahoma fans of yours, but I know we'll all be excited for the next book.
And everybody who's listening, I truly go out and read Casey's book. It is that rare book, like I said. Well, I'll give it my highest compliment, which is really, and I will be honest, it's very rare when you read a book and you wish you could have done it, because you realize it's that good, it was that rich a story, but you're also grateful that the writer did it, because you know the writer did it perfectly. They achieved that platonic ideal that I always have for a story.
Well, that's every story you write, David.
So go read it.
We're not ending on your absurdly
go. Everybody can go now.
Trial by Fire. No, I've got to shout out truly my favorite piece you ever wrote, and you know exactly what it is, Trial by Fire, this beautiful story which is told, it's perfect. It's truly just a rare work of journalism that is so perfectly structured, emotionally structured. So there you go. Yes, we've given everybody our relative, you know, reading assignments for the night, but thanks so much, David, for doing it.
Thank you.
I guess actually what we should say is, whatever book you're going to buy, mine or David's or Faulkner's or whatever,
Magic City.
Buy it from Magic City. Let's keep them in business and reward them.
And for And here's to getting back to Oklahoma, going to Magic City and going
Amen.
to see my
Amen.
friends. So
Thanks so
let's
much,
let
David.
this virus end.